Okay, so let's dive into this idea of European troops in Ukraine. After the fighting's done, you know, we've got this Financial Times article by Samuel Charap. He's a big name at the Rand Corporation, and he's really getting into what might happen, after everything calms down.
Yeah, and what's interesting is this isn't just some fringe idea anymore. Even Trump's team, the incoming administration, they're signaling they might be open to it. And some European governments, too.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy, right? Trump and Europe agreeing. Doesn't happen every day.
No, not exactly.
So that's why this deep dive is so important. Because even though more people are liking this idea, our expert is saying, hold on, there are some serious problems here.
Yeah, one of the biggest things Charap points out is everyone's talking about sending troops, but nobody seems to know what they'd actually DO. Are we talking UN peacekeepers, like the blue helmets, or is this something totally different?
Well, he uses this term tripwire force. I'll be honest, I had to look that up. Sounds kind of intense.
Yeah, it is. It's basically like a small military presence meant to stop a bigger attack. The idea is if anyone messes with them, it'll trigger a much bigger response.
So it's like testing the waters, see if things get out of control.
In a way, yeah. Think about the troops in West Berlin during the Cold War. Just being there sent a message to the Soviets. Any attack would mean a huge escalation. Really dangerous.
Okay, I get it. But then why is Charap so worried about using this in Ukraine? Wouldn't a tripwire force, in theory, stop Russia from doing anything stupid?
That's where it gets complicated. See, the tripwire worked in Berlin because everyone knew an attack meant war with NATO, and the Soviets weren't going to cross that line. But Ukraine isn't in NATO, so if Russia attacked a small European force there, well, it puts everyone in a really tough spot.
So you're saying it wouldn't be so clear-cut? NATO might not respond right away, which, now that I think about it, could make things even worse.
Exactly. If NATO doesn't do anything after their troops get hit, it would totally destroy their credibility. It would make Russia bolder and could even lead to more conflicts because it makes deterrence look weak. But on the other hand, a full-blown NATO response would mean war with Russia, which is obviously a terrifying thought.
So it's this huge gamble with incredibly high stakes. And Charap's saying we shouldn't even be thinking about this until we've tried everything else.
Right. He says talking about troops before any peace talks is way too early. It could actually make Russia less likely to agree to a ceasefire.
Okay, help me understand that. Why would bringing up troops now make Russia less willing to talk peace?
Well, one of Russia's biggest fears has always been NATO expansion. They see Ukraine as this buffer zone, and the idea of NATO troops right there, totally unacceptable to them. Bringing it up now before the fighting even stops is like poking the bear. It could make them dig in their heels even more and ruin any chance of a peaceful solution.
I see what you mean. It's like you're trying to make peace with someone, and they suddenly say, oh, and my big brother's coming too. You'd probably be pretty freaked out, right?
Exactly. It just creates more distrust and makes real dialogue way harder. And here's the thing. Even though this is supposed to be a European thing, Charap points out something really important that people forget. European militaries rely a lot on the U.S.
Wait, so Europe wants to send troops but needs America's help to do it. Isn't that kind of contradictory?
It's not that simple. Let's break that down a bit more. European militaries, they're definitely capable. But when it comes to big operations far away, especially something complicated like this, they need the U.S. for certain things.
Okay, so what does that look like? Give me some specifics.
Like air transport. A lot of European countries just can't move that many troops and equipment over long distances. They'd probably need U.S. cargo planes just to get to Ukraine.
Wow, so even getting there would be a problem. What about once they're on the ground? What else would they need the U.S. for?
Intelligence is another big one. The U.S. has all these satellites and surveillance that European countries just don't have. In a conflict, knowing what's going on is crucial. Those European forces would be relying on the U.S. for that information.
So even if European troops are the ones fighting, they basically have the U.S. as backup. That's not exactly European independence, is it?
It's a tricky balance. And this is why Charap is so worried about what it means for NATO. If the U.S. encourages this deployment, but then doesn't get involved if things go bad, it sends a really bad message to both allies and enemies. It's basically saying the U.S. won't back up its promises, which could make Russia bolder and undermine the whole idea of NATO.
That's a scary thought. It makes you realize how fragile this whole situation is. So we've got this potential powder keg with so many moving parts and unanswered questions. And then there's this American factor, which makes things even more complicated. It all feels incredibly tangled and messy.
It is, and that's exactly why this deep dive is so important. Charap doesn't give us any easy answers, and he's right to be worried. But it makes you wonder, what other options are there?
So if sending troops is such a bad idea, what else can we do? I mean, doing nothing doesn't seem right either. What are the alternatives to make sure there's peace in Ukraine after the fighting stops?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that policymakers are going to have to figure out. There's no easy answer. But Charap's article does make us think differently.
Okay, so let's think differently. What other options are there besides troops? What does Charap suggest?
Well, one thing people talk about is making Ukraine's defenses stronger, giving them the weapons and training they need to protect themselves from Russia, basically making them a harder target.
That makes sense. Give them the tools to defend themselves, but wouldn't that just make Russia angrier? They don't exactly like NATO-backed militaries on their border.
It's definitely a balancing act, but it's something we have to consider. If Ukraine can actually defend itself, it makes it less likely that Russia will try to invade again.
Okay, I get the logic. Deterrence through strength. But what if that backfires and just provokes Russia even more?
It's a risk, and that's why it has to be done carefully. It's not about making Ukraine a threat to Russia. It's about making any attack really painful for them.
So raising the stakes for Russia, making them think twice.
Exactly. But there are other options too. Another approach is focusing on economic and political support for Ukraine. Help them build a strong and successful democracy that can resist Russian pressure.
So less about military power and more about making Ukraine less appealing to invade. Kind of a soft power approach.
Yeah, you got it. Invest in Ukraine's future, strengthen their institutions, and bring them closer to the West. These are all long-term strategies, but they might be more effective than just sending in troops.
I'm starting to see why this is such a tricky issue. There's so many things to consider. And it sounds like there's no perfect solution. It's going to take a lot of different approaches and careful diplomacy to find a lasting solution.
You're right. And to make things even more complicated, each of these options has its own challenges and downsides. For example, giving weapons to Ukraine could start an arms race in the region. And economic aid, if it's not managed well, could lead to corruption.
So it's a minefield, really. It seems like every step we take could have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
It feels almost impossible to know how this will all turn out.
Welcome to geopolitics. There are rarely easy solutions. But that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to really understand the complexities and the risks. Charap's article reminds us that we can't just jump into military solutions without thinking about the consequences.
Okay, so we talked about the problems with sending troops, and we've touched on some other ways to achieve peace. But those also have their own challenges. So where do we go from here if those options are so tricky? And doing nothing isn't an answer. What is the best way to ensure peace in Ukraine after the fighting is over?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that needs a much deeper look. It's not enough to just list the options. We have to weigh their pros and cons. Think about the history and really think critically about what a lasting peace might look like.
That's where you, the listener, come in.
Exactly, because this isn't just some theoretical debate. This is about real people, real lives, and the future of a country. What we've done today is set the stage, show you how complex it all is, and hopefully get you thinking. Now it's up to you to keep the conversation going. Engage with the material and form your own opinions.
It's easy to get kind of overwhelmed by all this, the troops, the U.S., the different strategies. It's a lot.
Yeah.
But I think what's important is Charap isn't just pointing fingers. He's making us think.
Yeah, he's challenging us to look deeper, think about the unintended consequences, and really grapple with these tough questions.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. There are no easy answers when it comes to peace in Ukraine. It's going to take a lot of thought and a willingness to question what we think we know, and maybe even some uncomfortable compromises.
Absolutely. And that's where the real work starts. Because understanding the problem is only the beginning. The next step is figuring out what we can actually do as individuals and as a global community to make peace and stability a reality.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the downsides of sending troops, and we've touched on some other ways to get to peace. But those also have their own problems. So where do we go from here? What are some actual steps we can take to create a more peaceful future for Ukraine?
Well, one thing Charap touches on is the need for a better system for resolving conflicts. The current system, as we've seen, is often too slow and too focused on reacting. It's not great at dealing with these really complex situations like Ukraine.
So basically, we need better tools.
Exactly. And that might mean strengthening existing institutions like the UN,
Yeah.
or creating new ways to mediate and negotiate. It might also mean working together more, governments, NGOs, and regular people too.
Makes sense. But that sounds like a long-term project. What about right now? What can we do to calm things down? and make peace talks more likely.
That's where confidence building measures come in. These are small steps that can help build trust and set the stage for real negotiations.
Give me an example. What would that look like?
It could be as simple as setting up direct communication between the Ukrainian and Russian militaries to avoid accidents, or it could involve prisoner exchanges, humanitarian aid, or even cultural exchanges to promote understanding and dialogue.
Okay, I see how those things could help. But what about the big issues, like Crimea and the fighting in eastern Ukraine? How do we deal with those fundamental disagreements?
That's where it gets really tough. And honestly, there are no easy answers. Solving those problems will require compromise from everyone, recognizing each other's security concerns, and a long-term commitment to building a better relationship based on respect and cooperation.
So it's about more than just a peace treaty. It's about changing the whole relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and between Russia and the West.
Exactly. And that takes time, patience, and a lot of tough conversations. But I think what Charap's article is really saying is that peace isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's about creating a just and lasting future where everyone feels safe and respected.
And that's something worth working for, even if it's a long and difficult road. So to wrap things up, we've really dug into this idea of European troops in Ukraine. We've talked about the risks, the potential problems, and the fact that they'd be relying on the U.S., maybe more than people realize.
But we didn't just focus on the negatives. We also explored other options for peace, recognizing that those come with their own challenges.
And most importantly, we've emphasized how important you are, our listeners. You have a role to play in shaping this conversation. It's up to all of us to demand better solutions, hold our leaders accountable, and push for a future where peace is more than just a dream.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about, giving you the information and the insights to understand these complex issues and contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
So as we sign off, I want to leave you with this thought. What role do you want to play in building peace in Ukraine and beyond? It's a question worth thinking about.